Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was April 6th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Before we begin today's document, I just do want to give listeners a heads up that today's episode is about sexual assault, and therefore we're not going to play the jaunty intro music that is the usual starting of the episode. It just does not match with the content of today's episode, and I always will, if the particular document is one about an aspect of human suffering that gets into the level of detail that just doesn't fit right with the jaunty upbeat music of the usual episode, then I will skip it. All right. Today's document is one that I did not realize was going to be about sexual assault until I looked at what had been generated from the pipeline I had created with my agentic AI using the OpenClaw app. And in this situation, I had identified this document because I thought it was really going to be an interesting one from the point of view of interfaith relations. And I had noticed as I was flipping through this register 1819, and it's one of Violant's registers. It is which one? 1819 is the Varia. So this is the one that contains information from before Violant became queen, and it's got kind of I think a 2 or 3 year span. So there's a lot of documents from 1386 in there, and it goes, I think, through 1388. So here we've got a document that on the 4th line has a word that's really easy to read, Mahomet. Those M's, when the scribes are writing the letter M, it's very distinctive when they're doing it in a capital letter, and it really draws the attention of the eye. And so I noticed that this document was going to be somehow about Muslims because we have the mention of Muhammad. So in Catalan, Mahomet is the word for Muhammad. So that's what made me want to get into this document for April 6th. And then when I opened up what had been generated for the transcription and translation, I was really surprised because the word sodomy is included. And this gets us into a whole discussion of the history of sexuality. Let me just first point out where in this document that word is located. It is at the beginning of the line on line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, line 7. So there it's really clear, the capital S, O-D-O-M-I-A, sodomia. All right, the topic of the history of sexuality, and particularly sexuality in the Middle Ages, has received a lot of attention over the last 30 years. There's been a real explosion in the scholarship on the history of sexuality in all kinds of times and places in world history. And the historiography here is really focused on what's known as social construction. So the idea that a society's norms and values in a particular time and place will shape how people understand sexuality is one that is pretty well established in the scholarship at this time. One of the key theorists on this is Judith Butler, who wrote a book in the 1990s called Gender Trouble, which focuses on the understanding that gender is performative, that you enact it. And from that key insight that gender is not something biologically inherent, but is the result of all kinds of choices people make about how they're going to signal this or signal that, how they're going to decide, well, what's appropriate for my understanding of this gender identity, what's appropriate for my understanding of that gender identity, what should boys be doing, what should girls be doing, that this is all reenacted as people have imbibed over the course of their lives all these rules that society has and all the messages about what things should be, and that really it all boils down to customs, and there's nothing you can point to biologically that is the source of all of the behaviors and understandings and representations. And scholars of the history of sexuality have applied that insight from gender to sexuality. The work of the philosopher Michel Foucault has been very foundational here. But the field has really moved far beyond Michel Foucault. And in an episode about sexual assault, I think it's really important to understand that Michel Foucault was an abuser, and to not cover that up or downplay it. It's an essential part of understanding who he was, at the same time that you can point to the groundbreaking work that he did that allowed for other scholars to build on it and to bring us the levels of understanding of the history of sexuality that we have today. The major historian of medieval sexuality is Ruth Mazocharis. So if you're interested in learning about sexuality and the history of sexuality in the Middle Ages, you can do no better than to look at books by and articles by Ruth Mazocharis. One of the core texts for medieval sexuality and the history of is the book Doing Unto Others by Ruth Mazocharis. And I'll put that in the bibliography for this episode. And one of the key insights that is a takeaway from that book is that medieval people didn't think about sex as something that two people did together. It was really seen as what one person did to another person. And that's a real difficult thing for modern viewers, readers to try to imagine. And it also puts a really big focus on gender roles, because the whole idea of sexual activity in the Middle Ages was just so focused on the gender roles that were understood at that time. And to try to get into that in great detail is a really difficult thing to do in a podcast like this. Could have a whole gigantic podcast just about medieval sexuality. And so I'm not going to get too much more detailed into it, other than to say that when we see the word sodomy in a document from 1387, as we have here, the understanding of what is meant by that word is really not easy to understand. It is true that on the line prior, right before that word, we have the phrase aquel enorme e detestable crime de sodomia. So, the enormous and detestable crime. So, what's being described here is not just an assault. It is something that is seen through a lens of religion, and also a an understanding in some measure of some kind of going against what this person sees as natural. Now, what exactly did Violant have in mind when she wrote that word? I think she didn't have specifics in mind, honestly. I think that this word is one that has been really thrown around all over the place. And if you research it, it is a catch-all that means all kinds of sexual behavior that is just not the type that is condoned by the church. So it could be used simply for adultery sometimes. It's clear to me, though, that what's being described here is a same-sex sexual assault. And did it actually happen is a really important question to keep vibrant when looking at this document. Because she's talking about Muslims who are accused of doing this. And right away, we have to keep in mind that there was rumor mill, there was gossip. It was a very common thing to paint the religious minorities as an other, as a more beastly other, and to exaggerate what had happened in order to score points by, sensationalism and outrage. And so it's very likely when I read this document against the grain, in my mind, that it actually didn't happen in this way. And if I could see something from a Muslim source, then I would be more likely to believe it. And this is different than when we talked about sexual assault prior to this, because we don't have that barrier of going across an interfaith boundary, talking about a group of people that are already subject to having exaggeration about their criminal behavior because of the desire to amp up their otherness and the opposition to them as a group. So that's why I'm taking this with a grain of salt, and it's not to in any way diminish the claims of the victim, because we don't have the claim of the victim here. We don't really have the same situation as what we had with the rape case with the students in Montpellier. And there's a real key reason here, because in this document, what comes through is that the Muslim officials in the town of Novelda, they have dismissed this case. And it's also about a person, the victim here, is identified as someone who converted. So the story is, it's kind of covered in the beginning of the document here, that somebody had left Islam, and here it's phrased as La Secta de Mahomet. So it's in that fourth line. Someone had left it, Leshada La Secta de Mahomet, and had come newly to faith, the Catholic faith, so Fe Católica. And then there was a group of Moors who kidnapped this person, this convert, and allegedly kind of imprisoned them somewhere, and then committed the crime of sodomy against them. And then it also, further down, says that they had, to this person, blinded them, had put out their eyes. I mean, it's incredibly violent what they're being accused of. And that actually makes me think, okay, that's a detail that kind of is making me think, well, maybe this all did happen, because, that's something that you can really see that has happened to a person if they've been injured in that brutal, severe way. They've been blinded. The word that is used for that violence is obsegat, and it's in the fourth to last line on folio 95R. And I went to the Diccionario Valencia Catala Balearic, the kind of Oxford English dictionary, but for like the languages of Catalan and Valencian and so on. And there is usage from this time of that word for being blinded, but it also is a word for like a more metaphorical use. So like they were blinded to reason. So even that word, which in some ways would signal, okay, this was a real violent injury and mutilation, could also be taken as a metaphor in the metaphorical sense. I'm not leaning toward that interpretation. I'm leaning toward a literal interpretation. So honestly, maybe I was wrong before to doubt about whether this actually did happen. Maybe I need to take these additional details here and weigh them more heavily when thinking about what was actually going on that's represented in this document. So it's a difficult one. This is a really heavy situation here. It's made complicated by the fact that we've got the Christian monarch, the queen, talking about a group of Muslims. She's had some kind of report because here she is, she's intervening, saying, you Christian authorities, you should move forward with prosecuting the perpetrators. That's the purpose of this document, to say, okay, I've received this report that this crime has happened and that the Muslim authorities, those who were in charge of the Alhama of this town, Novalda, they didn't prosecute the criminals, the perpetrators. So now you Christian authorities, you now have the green light from me to ensure that justice is pursued for the people who did this to a Christian convert from Islam. It is so charged, right? Because the penalties for conversion at this time were extremely severe, because defecting from one side of the religious border to the other was seen as a major betrayal, because each side was very fearful about losing out to the other. And when somebody converted, it was seen as not just like, oh, their decision to change their belief. It was seen as an injury to the community, a very personal injury sometimes. There's a lot of examples of incidents where people who are converted are severely punished. And even in the Siete Partidas, the big legal document that came out for Castile, there's very spelled out consequences for anybody who converts from Christianity to Judaism or Islam. And then there's also like benefits and rewards for people who go the other direction. But then within those faith communities, there's severe sanctions against those who leave. So each side has severe punishments for people who convert away, but then they have rewards for people who convert into their side. So these were very fraught boundaries. And it's one thing to say that occasionally or even frequently you had people in an interfaith context cooperating with each other, doing business with each other. It's a whole other thing to say that there was tolerance for conversion, because that was a big no-no. And it's very rare to find anybody who is okay when one of their faith community members leaves and goes into the other faith. The people who are receiving them, who kind of they get converted into, they're always very celebratory because it's like a big win for them. So in this very tense situation around conversion, this culture and these social sanctions and norms around conversion, we now have this kind of revenge story where, according to this story, which we have to read with a grain of salt because we're hearing it from a Christian who's not going to be likely to be generous about thinking through the other side. So, but what we're hearing is that there were Muslims who took vengeance on one of their own who had converted to Christianity. A brutal vengeance, and one that involved sexual assault. All right, there are other examples of sodomy coming up in these documents. The archive of the Crown of Aragon and also some of the other archives from around this time. And it's not always a case of sexual assault like this. Sometimes people are discovered, and we can almost read into it that there was maybe a love affair going on, and they were discovered, and then it gets into the criminal records. We don't have many records outside of the criminal records, and of course that is leading to a distortion in what we know about same-sex relationships at this time. We do know that there was sex between people of the same gender, the same sex. And we know this because of the criminal records. There's also some poetry, some literature, some other interesting documents that allude to it happening. Jaume Riera y Sans, who we've referred to a bunch of times on the podcast, he wrote a really interesting article about the Dauphin, the firstborn son of Joan and Violant. He did a really interesting work called Sodomites Catalans, Historia y Vida Segles, and from 13th century to the 18th century. He went through a lot of the archives and he wrote down, it's a really big book, and it's published, I actually have a copy, and it's published in 2014. And yeah, it's really long. It's like over 600 pages. And he went through and compiled a whole bunch of documents about same-sex relations in the Crown of Aragon, in Catalan documents in the archives, all different archives. It's really monumental work and really interesting for the history of sexuality in the Crown of Aragon, in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. So I'll put a link to, a citation to that in the webpage for today's episode. All right, a lot going on in this document, a lot about religion and interfaith context, about history of sexuality, about representations of sexual assault. There is just a lot happening here, and I really could have made this a much longer episode about this particular document, but I think at this point I've covered the basics and given some context about the history of sexuality and about the interfaith context in the Crown of Aragon at this time. Oh, one last thing I'll say is that this was distant from Barcelona. So the location here is in a region that is very close to Granada. So that made the whole interfaith borderlines even more charged, because this was also on a border between a Muslim-ruled territory and then the province of the Kingdom of Valencia, a Christian-ruled territory. So it was a very tense situation, as it wasn't just about a group of Muslims just anywhere in the Crown of Aragon, but there was another fear of sort of Muslims really working for Granada and undermining the authority of this. So it was all just very fraught and very tense. And so that plays in to a lot of what we're seeing in this document too. Okay, so I covered that last point, and that is what I wanted to cover for this particular document, but it's a real intense one. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. And if you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. Remember, the Historian's Notebook motto is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.